still with you, or is she back in Alabama?
I'm taking him home probably tomorrow or the next day.
Okay.
But a friend came by day before yesterday and asked me, they said, we're going to have a place to stay. Can I pitch a tent in your grandchild? So I won't be by myself.
A literal tent, huh?
That's what he said. I don't care.
Remember the story of the camel's nose in the tent. Just be careful about that.
Now do what?
Tell her. Remember that story?
I think that's just a saying.
The camel inside the tent, tearing your house up.
The camel wanted to get his nose in the tent, so the Bedouin let him just put his nose in and said, "You're not coming in here." And he's what? Then he wanted to get his head in the tent. Finally, get his neck in. Next thing you know, the camel's in the tent. Something like that.
Well, hopefully he's gonna stay out in the front yard. But he'll be a good help. He'll be somebody there so that I'm not by myself.
I always thought after the first hunt, people start realizing what they're going home.
All right. Well, let's get started then. So we're on to the next chapter, book 2 of Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. This is, again, the book form of the series of speeches, series of talks that he gave on the BBC. This was during World War II. So that's the context of these comments. We need to keep that in mind because...
Did you find those recordings and listen to them? Are they archived?
The actual recordings? No, I'm sorry. I didn't look. I've got it on audio book, and I've been listening to the narrator version of it. It's not him, but I mean, there are some snippets of it. I think I played some of it the first night. So you would think if they had all of them and they had his voice from the BBC that they would just offer it as the audiobook version, but I don't know that they all exist. Tonight, chapter 2 is entitled The Invasion. He starts by saying, "Very well then, atheism is too simple. And I will tell you another view that is also too simple. It's the view I call Christianity and water. The view which simply says there is a good God in heaven and everything is all right, leaving out all the difficult and terrible doctrines about sin and hell and the devil and the redemption. Both these are boys' philosophies." And I always kind of go back and forth. Should I do the slide first and then read? I guess I'll read first, and then we can do the slide as the recap. It's no good asking for a simple religion. After all, real things are not simple. They look simple, but they are not. The table I am sitting at, or I guess I would say the podium that I'm standing at, if I was going to modify the statement here, looks simple, but ask a scientist to tell you what it is really made of, all about the atoms and how the light waves rebound from them and hit my eye and what they do to the optic nerve and what it does to my brain. And of course you find that what we call seeing a table lands you in mysteries and complications which you can hardly get to the end of. Reminds me of that book, Darwin's Black Box, right? You know, it's always, that's simple. So that extends to philosophical matters as well, right? So he says that, you say something simple, but doing it or understanding what actually is going on is a completely different matter. It's not hardly simple. A child saying a child's prayer looks simple. And if you're content to stop there, well and good. But if you're not, and the modern world usually is not, if you want to go on and ask what is really happening, then you must be prepared for something difficult. If we ask for something more than simplicity, it's silly then to complain that the something more is not simple. And I think he's talking about, from the unbeliever standpoint, they want to paint Christianity as being something simple. And there are a lot of Christians that want Christianity to be simple as well. But if you ask for something more than simplicity, then you need to be prepared. Be careful what you ask for, what you wish for, right? Very often, however, this silly procedure is adopted by people who are not silly, but who consciously or unconsciously want to destroy Christianity. Such people put up a version of Christianity suitable for a child of 6 and make that the object of their attack. Well, we call that the straw man argument, right? So they build up this straw man, real simple form, and then tear him down and say, hey, I did a good job there. I tore down this straw man. When the straw man really doesn't represent a man. It's, the idea of a man, but it's not really the complexity of a man. When you try to explain the Christian doctrine as it is really held by an instructed adult, they then complain that you're making their heads turn around and that it's all too complicated. And that if there really were a God and they're sure he would have made a religion simple because simplicity is so beautiful, etc., etc. You must be on your guard against these people, for they will change their ground every minute and only waste your time. Notice, too, their idea of God making religion simple, quote unquote, as if religion were something God invented and not his statement to us of certain, quite unalterable facts about his own nature. So again, atheists, those who are our opponents, like to paint us as being very simple-minded and having simplistic philosophies about things. But then if you start going off into the details and explaining to them, well, if you want to know, here's the details. Oh man, that's so complicated. Surely God wouldn't make it that difficult to understand. So they like to argue. Whatever you're arguing, they're going to argue the opposite, right? If it's too simple, then they say it ought to be more complex. And if it's so complex, it ought to be more simple. So again, atheism itself is too simple. But this Christianity and water, as he calls it, the simplified faith without difficult doctrines, is also too simple. Real things are never simple when examined closely. The scripture that was picked out, 1 Corinthians 2, 6 and 7, yet among the mature we do impart wisdom, although it is not a wisdom of this age or the rulers of this age who are doomed to pass away, but we impart a secret and hidden wisdom of God, which God decreed before the ages for our glory. And so the reason that this was picked out, this verse relates Lewis's point that Christianity is not simplistic, but contains deep wisdom that requires maturity to understand. Like Lewis's example of examining a table, Paul speaks of a wisdom that goes beyond surface level understanding. Of course, that's also, I think Paul kind of brushes on or touches on this when he talks about, wanting us to mature beyond the milk level of Christianity and needing to get into the meat of Christianity, right? Because we do need to get past that initial phase where, you understand it enough to obey the gospel, but then there's, much more to it than that we've got to get into and be able to defend. Besides being complicated, reality, in my experience, is usually odd. It's not neat, not obvious, not what you expect. For instance, when you have grasped that the Earth and the other planets all go around the sun, you would naturally expect that all the planets were made to match, all at equal distances from each other, say, or distances that regularly increased, or all the same size, or else getting bigger or smaller as you go further from the sun, some sort of order of that nature. In fact, you find no rhyme or reason that we can see about either the sizes or the distances. And some of them have one moon, one has 4, one has 2, some have none, and one has a ring. So, it's this beautiful kind of randomness to the world, this oddness, queerness, as he puts it later on. So some opponents create and attack simplified versions of Christianity. They complain about complexity when presented with mature doctrine. It kind of goes more with the first paragraph. Religion isn't something God invented, but his statement of unalterable facts about his nature. And of course, this is appropriate. When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I thought as a child. I reasoned like a child. When I became a man, I gave up childish ways. So again, that goes right along with it. I guess this is more the reality is odd and unexpected, right? So reality is not neat, obvious, or what we expect. Reality is, in fact, something you could not have guessed. That's one of the reasons that I believe Christianity, he says. It's a religion that you could not have guessed. It is offered up. If it offered us just the kind of universe we'd always expected, I should feel we were making it up. But, in fact, it is not the sort of thing anyone would have made up. You ever, what is that statement people make, that, this has to be true because that's just not something somebody weird, that it must be true, right? So that's kind of the point he's making. It has just that queer twist about it that real things have. So let us leave behind all these boys' philosophies, these oversimple answers. The problem is not simple, and the answer is not going to be simple either. What is the problem? A universe that contains much that is obviously bad and apparently meaningless, but containing creatures like ourselves who know that it is bad and meaningless. There are only two views that face all the facts. One is the Christian view that this is a good world and has gone wrong, but still retains the memory of what ought to have been. The other is called dualism. So again, reality is odd and unexpected. The solar system lacks the pattern we might expect. Christianity's unexpected nature suggests its truth. It has that queer twist about it that real things have. And the scripture here is from Isaiah 55, 8-9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. Classic, well-known verse says. These passages reinforces Lewis's point that reality, especially divine reality, doesn't conform to our expectations. God's ways are unpredictable and higher than human understanding, just as Lewis notes the unexpected patterns in creation. We just can't understand some things. We just don't have the capacity. You wouldn't expect for your dog to understand things. You take your dog to the vet, you take your cat to the vet, right, to get a shot, and they're wailing and carrying on, but they don't know it's for their own good that what is happening to them. They get a shot,
I
right?
know it's right good, but I still wail.
Yeah. Well, we all do. All right. So there's Christianity, the Christian view that this is a good world gone wrong, but still retains a memory of what ought to have been. The other is the view called dualism. So those are the two that he says. So dualism means the belief that there are two equal and independent powers at the back of everything, one of them good and the other bad, and that this universe is the battlefield in which they fight out an endless war. He says, I personally think that next to Christianity, dualism is the manliest and most sensible creed on the market, but it has a catch in it. The two powers or spirits or gods, the good one and the bad one, would that be kind of like the yin and the yang, or that kind of idea? That's the classic idea, I guess. You got God and you got Satan, and they're always a dueling. But it's more nuanced than that. You can't really just put it in those terms. But he says, so these the good one and the bad one are supposed to be quite independent. They both existed from all eternity. Neither of them made the other. Neither of them has any more right than the other to call itself God. Each presumably thinks it is good and thinks the other bad. One of them likes hatred and cruelty, the other likes love and mercy, and each backs its own view. Now, what do we mean when we call one of them the good power and the other the bad power? Either we're merely saying that we happen to prefer the one to the other, like preferring beer to cider, or else we are saying that whatever the two powers think about it and whichever we humans at the moment happen to like, one of them is actually wrong, actually mistaken, regarding itself as good. It was a long, long sentence. I was just going to say, can I not drink either beer or cider? Can I not like both? Because anyway, I don't know about the beer. It always, like, it just smells hideous to me. I don't know. But, so he's saying again that it comes down to a preference with dualism. So there's what we call the good power, the bad power. They've always existed. They've always fought each other. And this goes back to, there's plenty of tales. There are plenty of stories, right, that are handed down from generation to generation, talking about these kinds of good versus evil, right? But the thing that you have to keep in mind is that how do we know one is good and one is evil? How do you know that one is right and one is wrong? The fact that there could be an absolute truth doesn't come into play with this, right? Because what one person thinks is good might be another person's bad and vice versa. And so how do you say one is good? And then it comes down to just your personal preference, right? It comes down to what you think at the moment is right or wrong. So again, it gets into this kind of dubious sort of, depending on the way you look at it, philosophy, which we have talked about before. So we're saying at this level, whatever the two powers think about it and whichever we as humans at the moment happen to like, one of them is actually wrong, actually mistaken, regarding itself as good. So one of these powers could say it's good or bad, but really they could be mistaken, right? Now, if we mean merely that we happen to prefer the first, then we must give up talking about good and evil at all. So that just goes out the window, because good means what you ought to prefer quite regardless of what you happen to like at any given moment. So we're back to this argument, right? We've heard this argument several times, but again, we're just reminding ourselves of it. So if you're arguing this line of reasoning, good just means what you ought to, or good means what you ought to prefer versus what you happen to prefer at any given moment. If being good means simply joining the side you happen to fancy for no real reason, then good would not deserve to be called good. That just does away with the very meaning of the word good. If it's 6 of one, half a dozen of another, right? That would be the phrase we use. So we must mean that one of the two powers is actually wrong and the other right. But the moment you say that, you're putting into the universe a third thing in addition to the two powers, some law or standard or rule of good, which one of the powers conforms to and the other fails to conform to. But since the two powers are judged by this standard, then this standard, or the being who made this standard, is farther back and higher up than either of them, and he will be the real God. In fact, what we meant by calling them good and bad turns out to be that one of them is in a right relation to the real ultimate God, and the other in a wrong relation to him. So, our universe contains obvious evil and apparent meaningless, yet we as creatures recognize it as evil and meaningless. Two views face all the facts, Christianity and dualism. For the creation was subjected to futility, not willingly, but because of him who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be set free from its bondage to corruption and obtain the freedom of the glory of the children of God. For we know that the whole creation has been groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. So this comes from the idea that it aligns with Lewis's description of a good world gone wrong, creation subjected to futility and corruption, yet with hope of restoration, which is the Christian understanding that Lewis contrasts with the dualism idea. And the problem with dualism is that Dualism posits two equal independent powers, good and evil. Calling one good and one bad implies a higher standard beyond both. This standard, or the being who made it, would be the real God. And for this thought, James 1:17, for every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. So this verse supports his argument against dualism by identifying God as the source of all goodness with no shadow or variation, suggesting there cannot be an equally powerful source of evil independent of him. The same point can be made in a different way. If dualism is true, then the bad power must be a being who likes badness for its own sake. But in reality, we have no experience of anyone liking badness just because it is bad. Well, I don't know
I'm
now.
not sure about that either. I mean,
There are some
when I
politicians.
read that, I thought, with the type of anarchy in our society today, I think people have crossed over the dark side that far. I believe that there are some who deliberately seek out the evil and the bad. Satan worshipers would be a classic example. Some of them are just buffoons or playing games, playing church, but
Mm-hmm.
there are some who are serious about that, giving themselves up to the very worst thing they can do.
Yeah.
And they'll do it, and to stifle all instincts which we know to be good. I don't know, maybe he's a little bit too optimistic about the human race there.
Should I just say Democrat, or is that like, could I just succinctly? I'm just kidding.
We should talk about progressives in Canada too and throw them in.
Yeah.
Hitler believed that his evil was good because it suited his idea of good and bad.
Mm-hmm.
The Jews were evil, so
Well,
he was good.
I think that there would be a distinction because, he thought that what he was doing was good. But yet there are people that do bad things because they are bad, because they want to do bad things. And they really, they like being bad, I guess, for lack of a better. They enjoy being evil. They enjoy the power that it seems to give them, even though it's fleeting. Those who live by the sword will die by the sword, though. We ought to keep that in mind. So he says, now, of course, he was living in, 80 years ago. And
Got that bad even with Hitler.
yeah, the nearest we can get to it is in cruelty. But in real life, people are cruel for one of two reasons. Either because they are sadists, that is, because they have a sexual perversion which makes cruelty a cause of sensual pleasure to them, or else for the sake of something they are going to get out of it, money or power or safety. But pleasure, money, power, and safety are all, as far as they go, good things. I don't think we'd disagree with that. They can be used for good or evil. They're kind of benign in certain ways. The badness consists in pursuing them by the wrong method or in the wrong way or too much. I do not mean, of course, that the people who do this are not desperately wicked. I do mean that wickedness, when you examine it, turns out to be the pursuit of some good in the wrong way. I was going back to that Hitler comment and so what was Hitler doing? Was he trying to do the good thing in the wrong way or the wrong thing in the good? I mean, that was just the wrong thing in the wrong way. It was just wrong all around. So I'm sure we'd classify him differently.
Example of what Lewis is talking about.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, as twisted as he was a nationalist, so he stood up for Deutschland. Whatever's good for our nation,
Mm-hmm.
whatever's good for Germany, and if it takes eradicating a whole population of ethnic minorities, we'll do that. And it's just you have to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Crack a few eggs and make an omelet, kind of thing. Hitler. I'm not in any way defending. I'm just saying he probably did think that there was an overarching good so far as the Germans.
Oh, certainly. He thought that there was good, but, eliminating people was, the final solution was not the way to do that.
I do think there are people, and perhaps a lot of his minions, who
Yeah, oh, that is
There are
definitely true.
People that far gone. It's hard for us to fathom.
Yeah, there were some
Jews
scientists
still
and things.
what went on, do not know that there were evil people.
Yeah.
But there's always people that take advantage of the situation to do the wicked things that they want to do. They use the cover of, war or whatever in order to inflict terrible things on people.
Or George Floyd,
Sure.
killed by the police.
Sure. Yeah, that is definitely true. Maybe Hitler should have just deported him. Anyway.
Well, he wanted the final solution. That would have just been a solution.
I was just kidding with that. But anyway, he says, you can be good for the mere sake of goodness. You cannot be bad for the mere sake of badness.
Again, normally that would be true.
I think he just can't conceive of that, maybe. Nobody thinks that there are people that are just absolutely void of any kind of conscience. Yeah.
That's a good
Mm-hmm. So, again, maybe he is just a little too optimistic about the human condition. I guess it's before they uncovered the concentration camps, maybe. You could... Because he doesn't mention that. You'd think that he might mention these atrocities directly, He says, you can do a kind action when you're not feeling kind and when it gives you no pleasure, simply because kindness is right. Again, I'm going to get an objection. But no one ever did a cruel action simply because cruelty is wrong, only because cruelty was pleasant or useful to him. I think that I would probably tend to agree with that. I mean, I think that people do evil things because it brings them pleasure to do it. But evil for the sake of just evil, I guess if you were to look at some of these people that think that, and you can read, there are some terrible stories of people that have been murdered by these, Satanist types who were doing it because they thought that they would gain some kind of supernatural power. And so they do say, I'm doing this for this power. So again, it's for a purpose, but I'm doing it, in the name of Satan for, this. So they're doing it in the name of evil for evil's sake. So, I think that there are some exceptions to his overarching rule that he puts out here. I don't think that you would necessarily say your average person out there that you run into at the grocery store, serial killers aside, you would classify in this regard, right? You would think people just aren't, in general, right, placed into these camps. Really?
Oh, I haven't seen that really. Like here? I've seen the number of sex offenders who are in your neighborhood.
That you can't, yeah.
I didn't know. I'm not surprised though. Murders.
Yeah. Is that kind of like that 6 degrees of Kevin Bacon, Yeah, 14. that game. There's a card game or something. The 7 degrees of Kevin Bacon. It's like anybody, the actor, right? Kevin Bacon. Anyway, and the joke was he'd been in all these movies, and so wasn't an actor you could name that somebody didn't act in a movie with that actor who acted with that actor who acted with Kevin Bacon. So you can never get more than 7 degrees of separation away. But I think that's pretty much true of any human being. Like any human being, within 7 other people, you can get to any other person on the planet. Anyway, it's kind of interesting. You look at the statistics and probabilities and that kind of thing, the numbers.
Well, if that were true, what implications might that have for evangelism?
Yeah, that's a good point. How many people you come into contact with, and that could spread. Well, it's like contagion. It's like the spread of germs, or It's how supposedly you can't fold a piece of paper more than 6 times, 7 times, something like that. Because at some point you're trying to fold a ream of paper, and you can't do that. So it goes up exponentially. Every extra person is an exponential increase in the number of interactions with other people. So just the law of exponentials tells you that. So yeah, for the sake of evangelism, sure. If you tell 2 friends and they tell 2 friends and so on and so on and so on, basically the entire population of the planet gets educated on that topic. That's how gossip goes. That's how rumors spread, right? Faster than the truth.
It's no longer a secret if you tell it to somebody.
That's true. Anyway, well, let me proceed on. So, so the nature of evil, no one likes badness for its own sake. we can come up with some exceptions that we think are to that rule. People pursue good things in wrong ways. That happens a lot. You can be good for goodness sake, but not bad for badness sake. There's a song that I'm reminded of. What's that song? So be bad for badness sake. No, that's not how it goes.
I remember the song, but don't remember the tune.
It's a Christmas tune. You better watch out, yeah. It's probably in a Despicable Me movie. They probably have a version of that. But anyway, that's what I think of too. But that's all, comic, funny stuff. But, being bad for badness sake, you can think of some people that I think would fall into that category. So we'll take exception. And Scripture 3, Genesis 3, 1 through 6, this is, I guess, a paraphrase. So when the woman saw the tree was good for food and that it was a delight to the eyes, that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. This passage illustrates Lewis's point that evil is the pursuit of good things, food, beauty, wisdom, in the wrong way, disobeying God's command. Eve didn't desire evil itself, but desired good things through wrong means. She saw that the tree was good for food, so it's a good thing. But it was bad because she was disobeying God.
And sometimes beauty is not always good.
That's very true.
Beautiful, but if you reach out and touch it, it's gonna hurt.
Let's see. I don't think that this is. I don't think we're quite there yet. I don't know. I've broken it up into these kind of smear together. So I'll leave that up there, but we won't get there quite yet. So he says, in other words, badness cannot succeed even in being bad in the same way in which goodness is good. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Goodness is, so to speak, itself. Badness is only spoiled goodness in his argument. And there must be something good first before it can be spoiled. We called sadism a sexual perversion. That's got to be a Freudism right there. I don't know. But I don't think I disagree with that. We called sadism a sexual perversion, but you must first have the idea of a normal sexuality before you can talk of its being perverted. And you can see which is the perversion, because you can explain the perverted from the normal and cannot explain the normal from the perverted. It follows that this bad power, who is supposed to be on an equal footing with the good power and to love badness in the same way as the good power loves goodness, is a mere bogey. In order to be bad, he must have good things to want and then pursue in the wrong way. He must have impulses which were originally good in order to be able to pervert them. But if he is bad, he cannot supply himself either with good things to desire or with good impulses to pervert. He must be getting both from the good power, and if so, he is not independent. He is part of the good power's world. He was made either by the good power or by some power above them both. So you can see what he's getting at when he's talking about evil for evil's sake, good for goodness sake. And, regardless, I think you can, and I think we do make the argument that Satan, started out good. God didn't create an evil being, right? God doesn't. But the fact is, God in creating light creates darkness somehow, right? You can't have darkness without light. But God is light. God is that. And so what is the darkness? But it's the separation from that light. So again, God himself is not doing anything other than illuminating the darkness that exists in our hearts, being disobedient, I guess. So now we get to this idea about evil being parasitic. Evil can't supply itself with good things to desire or good impulses to pervert. It has to get them from the good power. Therefore, evil is parasitic. Put it more simply still, to be bad, he must exist and have intelligence and will. But existence, intelligence, and will are in themselves good. Therefore, he must be getting them from the good power. Even to be bad, he must borrow or steal from his opponent. And do you now begin to see why Christianity has always said that the devil is a fallen angel? That is not a mere story for the children. It is a real recognition of the fact that evil is a parasite, not an original thing. So now we're getting into ideas I think that we can all get on board with, right? The powers which enable evil to carry on are powers given it by goodness. All the things which enable a bad man to be effectively bad are in themselves good things. Resolution, cleverness, good looks, existence itself. That's why dualism in a strict sense will not work, just the good and the evil, because there's got to be an overarching yardstick, an overarching power that is the standard by which we decide that one is good and one is evil, right? And so the verse here, John 8:44, you are of your father the devil, and your will is to do your father's desires. He was a murderer from the beginning and does not stand in the truth, because there is no truth in him. When he lies, he speaks out of his own character, for he is a liar and the father of lies. I guess that begs the question as to, if we're, and I don't know that we understand the devil's intent other than jealousy, perhaps, being jealous of God. What would cause, someone to rebel against this being of unlimited goodness and light, other than jealousy, perhaps. But the fact is, the devil did make his decision, and he corrupted God's creation, human beings, through his lies, and he is the father of lies. Very much, definitely that, right? I mean, who is the father? Who would be the father of lies? The devil. I mean, there is a father of the lies. Well, it can't be God. God is not the father of those lies. Now, again, the lie, however, depends on God. So again, this is where you get into this parasitic concept, right? How can a lie exist unless there is a truth against which to measure it? So again, it's this darkness versus light. So again, God did not create the lie, but he exposes the lie. He is the thing by which you can decide whether something is the truth or a lie. And so that is what the devil brings to the table, is the lie. And the lie itself, he packages in something that looks like the truth because it carries perhaps a grain of the truth in it, right? He says, you'll not surely die if you eat of this, fruit. Although, that was not true. I mean, they did die, not at that moment, but they died spiritually, right? But then they did die because they weren't there in the garden anymore. So you won't die. Well, I mean, not immediately. So, again, it's like a used car salesman. Why I would compare a used car salesman to the devil, but anyway. So we'll move along. I don't know why I brought that up.
I just bought one about 2 months ago and just got it out of the shop off the
So again, that's why dualism just doesn't work, because you can't just arbitrarily say good and bad. There's got to be an absolute standard by which to measure. So let's talk about the devil as a fallen angel. I freely admit that real Christianity, as distinct from Christianity and water, goes much nearer to dualism than people think. One of the things that surprised me when I first read the New Testament seriously was that it talks so much about a dark power in the universe, a mighty evil spirit who was held to be the power behind death and disease and sin. The difference is that Christianity thinks this dark power was created by God and was good when he was created and went wrong. Christianity agrees with dualism that this universe is at war, but it does not think this is a war between independent powers. It thinks it is a civil war, a rebellion, and that we are living in a part of the universe occupied by the rebel. So again, evil is a parasite, not an original thing. The powers enabling evil are given by goodness and twisted. Good things, resolution, cleverness, existence, can be used for evil. Ezekiel 28:12-15, again paraphrasing or plucking out parts. You were the signet of perfection, full of wisdom and perfect in beauty. You were in Eden, the garden of God. You were blameless in your ways from the day you were created till unrighteousness was found in you. So this prophetic passage, often interpreted as referring to Satan, describes how an originally perfect created being fell, aligning with Lewis's point that evil began as something good that was corrupted, not as something independently evil from the beginning. And you think about this, we completely agree with this concept because that is what little babies are. Little babies are perfect. They're harmless. They're pure, free from sin. And then as we age, we react to the influences that come our way, either by giving in to those temptations or we stay away from those temptations. But sooner or later, something's going to get us, right? And it always has, because that is human nature, right? We tend to give in to things like that. And God knows that, and that's why he gives us the blood of Christ to cleanse us when we do, if we will be penitent, right? So again, you see these themes over and over and over again. Enemy-occupied territory, that is what this world is. Christianity is the story of how the rightful king has landed, you might say landed in disguise, and is calling us all to take part in a great campaign of sabotage. When you go to church, you're really listening into the secret wireless from our friends. This is where you're getting into the World War II stuff, right? You're listening in to the secret wireless from our friends. That is why the enemy is so anxious to prevent us from going. He does it by playing on our conceit and laziness and intellectual snobbery. Christianity sees the universe at war, not a war between independent powers, but a civil war, a rebellion. And we live in occupied territory occupied by the rebel. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood, but against the rulers, against the authorities, against the cosmic powers over this present darkness, against the spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly places. This captures Lewis's cosmic war imagery, describing our struggle against spiritual forces of evil that have authority in this fallen world, supporting his view of living in enemy-occupied territory. I know someone will ask me, do you really mean at this time of day to reintroduce our old friend, the devil, hoofs and horns and all? Well, now that, come on. It's not the comic book. It's not the cartoon devil. The devil appears as an angel of light, right? I mean, he has an attractiveness, has a beauty about him. So anyway, here comes the straw man. Do you really mean to reintroduce our old friend, the devil, horn and hoofs and all? Well, what the time of day has to do with it, I do not know. And I am not particular about the hoofs and the horns, but in other respects, my answer is yes, I do. I do not claim to know anything about his personal appearance. If anybody really wants to know him better, I would say to that person, don't worry. If you really want to, you will. Whether you like it when you do is another question. So Christianity is the story of the rightful king landing in disguise. We're called to take part in this campaign of sabotage. Churches listening to secret wireless from our friends. Colossians 1:13-14, he has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins. This passage beautifully captures Lewis's imagery of kingdoms at war with Christ, the rightful king who delivers us from the domain of darkness into his own kingdom. That was it. Just as Lewis describes the king who has landed to reclaim his territory. And we talk about that, I like to use that phrase, the borders of your kingdom here in this world. And that's what this is. We're in that kingdom, and we're in the earthly portion of the heavenly kingdom, which is the church. So we're translated into that kingdom when we're baptized, the kingdom of his dear Son. So again, it is a spiritual warfare. I mean, you see that constantly in the Bible. The references that it is a spiritual warfare, and we're out there trying to win souls. It is a fight, and we need to be prepared. And again, the sword. Paul uses that imagery, right? Or what book is that out of? 2 Corinthians. Okay, so that's Paul then for sure. I was just making sure it wasn't. But anyway, that imagery is used because that's what we're in. We're in a spiritual war for souls, not money, right? Not anything else, but the very thing that is worth more, it's infinitely more. The thing that has no value that you could put an actual number on. It's so worth so much, and it's all or nothing. I mean, you think about the soul. For what would a man give for a soul? There's nothing that is worth giving your soul for, because we're dealing in infinities here, right? We're dealing in the infinite value of a human being, the infiniteness of the world that is to come after this one. Heaven for infinity, hell for infinity. So these are infinities we're fighting over. There's no half measures. All right, well, let me